And what I want to talk about today is failure. And I want to talk about the fear of failure that I find that many men silently struggle with. Can you relate to that at all? I know I do. I know when I was a young man, I was terribly afraid of failing in my life. I don't even know if I could have defined what failure is, but I felt it, I feared it, and even now at the age of 48, I still wrestle with that demon on a regular basis. And so a few years ago, I did a study on the whole biblical notion of fear. And I did talks on the fear of death, the fear of failure, the fear of relationships, the fear of God. And so I was looking at that last night and just thinking, man, this is a great reminder for me where I'm at in my life right now, and I think these men would relate to it. So to get us kind of into this, let me just ask a few questions, and you can just answer these to yourself or maybe raise your hand depending on what you want to do. How many of you have ever experienced or gone through a relational failure? And before you raise your hand, let me define a relational failure as a breakdown in a friendship, or a breakdown with a spouse or a family member, a work associate, an employee, service provider, a neighbor, really a breakdown with any person in your life that you have not been able to completely reconcile. And there's still tension with that person. How many of you have ever had that kind of a relational failure? I guess so. Almost all of us. How many of you have ever experienced a sports failure, tried a sport and found yourself lacking, whether it be basketball, baseball, football, track, hockey, tiddlywinks, or chess? How many of you have ever experienced a sports failure? I certainly have. How many of you have ever experienced a job failure? Just found yourself in a career or a part of your career in which you just didn't do really well at it? Let me see your hand raised. Okay, so less of you, but that's interesting. In 1991, I got to my first church, and they asked me, I'd only been there a few months, and they asked me if I would run children's ministry. And I remember saying to them that I thought this was a gift-based ministry, church, and they said, well, it is, but we're stuck, and we need you to run children's ministry. And I spent about a year in children's ministry in my first church. And I realized that when I tried to explain to the children the Hypostatic Union of Christ that I was not the best children's minister. And I didn't last very long in that. And I don't think nobody would have ever said, even now, people like me, Jamie was a good children's minister. I didn't do well at that. One could argue I failed at that. How many have ever experienced financial failure? Had financial failure in your life where you just got yourself in trouble? I think a lot of us. When I looked at the hands out there today, you know what I thought to myself? I thought there's an awful lot of failure in this room. There is. It's actually pretty typical and normal, because the reality is that imperfect men will fail at times, if not a lot of times. And statistically speaking, failure is going to happen to all of us in this world. As many of you know, I'm from Cleveland. I'm a Cleveland Browns fan. For 3 decades, for literally 30 complete years, I have experienced failure in rooting for a professional football team. Not since the mid-1985s, when the Cleveland Browns were called the Cardiac Kids and they were giving Denver a run for their money when it came to the AFC Championship, has Cleveland ever had anything close to a winning season. I know people don't like to hear it because you don't want to pick on a team. The Browns are my favorite team, but they're failures. And every single year, I go into it with the utmost optimism, thinking this will be the year that the Browns succeed. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm getting used to failure in a lot of areas of my life, even in that particular area. And yet we still don't like failure. It's no fun. It's always a difficult thing. I haven't met anybody yet that longs for failure. And so the question I want you and I to wrestle with this morning is, how do we make friends with failure? How do we deal with knowing there's going to be a reality in our life, knowing that we're going to have it in our life? How do we have such a relationship with failure that we're not always trying to avoid it, that we're not always bemoaning it, that we're not always dreading it, but somehow maybe even find God in the midst of our failure? In fact, that's going to be a huge thing for you guys this morning. That I'm going to submit to you that the Bible has throughout all of the scriptures, has throughout it the fact that God is ever present in the midst of failure, and at times I'm going to suggest it's even His will for us, especially when it comes to worldly things. That there's times when God actually is the one causing, even the champion of our failure. And though we think it's of Satan, how many times do you have a Christian say that's of Satan? Heaven will actually reveal it was of God. Heaven will actually reveal that it was God who was allowing, even causing us to go through certain things. So 4 things I want to share with you about failure that I believe will help us deal with it effectively. And again, like Howard, if you want to, you can take notes on your empty page or just listen in, because I think you'll remember most of these things. Now, the first thing I think we need to do with failure is begin by defining failure and defining success accurately. I think many Christians mess up here. We need to begin any discussion or biblical look at failure by defining failure and defining its opposite, success, accurately. Men, this is clearly, hands down, the most important truth in understanding and assessing and dealing with failure. To clearly delineate exactly what failure is and exactly what success is. So let me explain. If you were to look up failure in Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, you would find the definition of failure is defined as this: to fall short of one's goals, to disappoint the expectations of. That's failure. To fall short of one's goals or to disappoint the expectations of. It's simply not reaching the goals that you set for yourself or that were set for you by someone else in whatever situation you're in. It's not measuring up to a particular standard that you either set for yourself or that somebody else or culture sets up for you. And so once you start to understand failure in this light, I don't know if you're starting to see it yet, you realize that it starts to have a bit less of a bite, because failure now is something which is based upon one's values, goals, and priorities. That's all failure is. It's a value, goal, or priority that you have for your life or you've adopted for your life from the culture or setting around you. You've now imposed it on you, and if you don't meet it, then you did not succeed or you failed. And so it's totally subject to what a person holds important or a goal that a person has in life. And so think about it just for a second here. If there's no goal or standard then, or if you don't agree with the goal or standard or buy into it, then quite frankly, you cannot fail, at least in your own eyes. Failure depends on shared upon goals, expectations, and standards, and you have to fall short of something in order to fail. So in a very real sense, failure is in the eye of the beholder. That's the first thing we need to see. I'm not trying to say there isn't such thing as failure. There is. But I think many times things that we call failure might not be, as you'll see in a second here, as much failure as we think it is. It's simply failure imposed on us by others. Failure is in the eye of the beholder, just like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Let me give you an example that I think will help show you this. Say in our career-obsessed, material-focused culture, you happen to prioritize things like family, church, spirituality, and leisure much more than culture does. And as a result of this, say in your particular situation, you pass up a job promotion that you've been offered, because even though it would be more money, it would threaten church, family, leisure, the things that you hold important. And just because there's so many hours in the week and your boss wants you to do it, you say, I can't do this job promotion. And so as a result of that, you live in a smaller house, you have less toys and gadgets than your neighbor, and your retirement might be less than what your neighbor's is. And you do this, again, not because you're lazy and not because you're less ambitious, but because your ambitions and your values lie elsewhere, again, with family and church and things like that. Let me ask the question, are you a failure, yes or no? No, of course not. What if your neighbor says you're a failure? Are you a failure? No. What if culture says you're a failure? Are you a failure? No. What if your extended family says you're a failure? Are you a failure? No. So though that's a simple example, that's an example right there of what we're talking about with failure. That the success and failure depend on how you define it. And there are tons of areas where you and I are going to define things as followers of Jesus Christ differently than the world around us. And that has to alter how we think about success and failure. And by the way, the converse of this is also true with this example. If you were to take that job and attain all that job success and monetary goals would provide, but in the process were to lose your marriage, lose your emotional and relational health, lose your spirituality, are you then a success? Of course not. But think about it. There are plenty of Christians walking around today just with that example, and we're going to flesh this out more here in a minute, that have got the world by the tail. They've attained all the things that the world tells us we should have, and yet their marriage is not what God would want it to be. Their spirituality, their spiritual life is not what God would want it to be. All these things. And so the world labels them as success. Through heaven's eyes, they're not quite the success that the world says or thinks that they are. And so failure and success are definitely to be judged by a different standard than what many of us tend to judge them by. You know, as I was thinking about this last night, I thought Jesus, by almost anybody's standards, unless you really knew who he was and is, was a failure. I mean, if you were to read the Gospels and not get to the end of it, but say just get 3/4 of the way or even 4/5 of the way through the Gospels, you would label Jesus a failure. I'm not being sacrilegious here. The religious leaders saw him as a failure. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, they all saw him as a failure. He did not meet their expectations of what a Messiah would be. He did not live up to the religious code that they had. And so in their eyes, if you were to poll them and say, was Jesus a success, they would say, of course not. The secular and political leaders in Jesus' day saw him as a failure. Pilate, the governor, saw him as a failure. The guards who were at the tomb saw him as a failure because he was dead and in the grave. Even the disciples, up until the end, just the very end, saw him as a failure during the last week of his life and during the crucifixion. And yet, would anybody say that Jesus Christ, looking back now in history, was a failure? Very, very few people would say that, even people that aren't Christians. So what's the difference? Well, Jesus had a very different agenda than the world had. He had a different set of goals and values. He had a different purpose and a different plan. And so maybe now you can see Jesus defined success for his life very differently than the world he entered into. And that's going to be very important for you and I. And so when the world labeled him a failure, as Paul the Apostle would say, when the world labeled him a fool, then the reality is he didn't buy any of those labels. He didn't buy into any of that. He defined success and failure very differently than the world around him. And all I can say is that you don't even need to be hyper-spiritual to live this out. You really don't. In other words, I would argue that you and I, and even our world, latches onto this concept that we don't always need to buy into what success and failure are defined by our culture around us. And there are plenty of people, even non-Christians, that function this way. There's actually a magazine, it's still online today, I checked it out last night, called Failure Magazine. This is true. It's a magazine committed to the discussion of failure. You look it up today, this morning, go to Failure Magazine, and it's full of all of these stories of things that seemed like a failure, but when you look at them from a different perspective and sort of nudge your definition of failure, they were actually not failures. And so the Edsel is a great example that they cite on their homepage, I was noticing last night. But they also had a great article about a decade ago that I used when I was putting this talk together on the Corvair. How many of you guys remember GM Chevrolet's Corvair? Yeah, a lot of you guys remember that car. I still look on Craigslist every now and then and think, gosh, I'd love to buy a Corvair, but my wife would probably kill me, and that would be a failure. And so, but as you guys know, the Corvair came out in 1960, and it came out to a lot of enthusiasm. It was competing back then with the Volkswagen Beetle. It was an economy car in a day of muscle cars that had an air-cooled 6-cylinder engine that was in the rear of the car, which was an innovative design. And they came out with all different models, a two-door, a four-door, a pickup truck eventually, a convertible, even a sport model. And yet very quickly, the Corvair started to struggle. You all remember that. And it struggled for two reasons. One, most people don't realize, is that there was a ton of competition for the Corvair back then. I didn't know this until I read the article, but at the same time the Corvair was introduced, Dodge came out with a Lancer, Plymouth came out with a Valiant, Ford countered with the Falcon, Mercury came out with their Comet, Chevy even came out with the Chevy 2 that would eventually become a Nova, and eventually Ford came out with the Mustang, and that destroyed everything. And so the competition for the Corvair was great right from the get-go, and that made it very difficult for that car to succeed. But the main reason most people see it as a failure is because of one person. What was his name? Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, and he used the Corvair as his main example, and he argued that the Corvair was unstable and prone to rollover accidents. And it became such a big issue that the National Highway and Safety Administration, the NHTSA, opened an investigation into the Corvair. And that just sunk it. As soon as that happened, as you guys, some of you remember, you lived through this, the Corvair died within a decade. And so most people look back on the Corvair and see it as a failure. Even today, when you talk to many people about the Corvair, they kind of cringe and say it was a failure of a car. However, this article points out you might want to look at it a little differently. For instance, the National Highway Transportation or Traffic Safety Administration actually exonerated the Corvair. The news media didn't really highlight that one, but they did an intricate study into the Corvair, and I quote, they concluded that the Corvair was no more prone to accidents and rollovers than any other comparable car of the period. So they completely exonerated it. They proved what Nader said in his book was wrong. Even more important, however, there were 1.8 million Corvairs that came out over that 10 years that it was produced. And the Corvair pioneered turbocharging, four-wheel independent suspension, and unibody construction. In fact, the four-wheel independent suspension of the Corvair would appear later on the Corvettes. To this day, there's over 130 local chapters of the Corvair Society of America found from Idaho to Amsterdam. So there's a lot of people who still like the Corvairs. And I remember reading that article, and I read it again last night, highlighted everything, and I'm thinking, I guess sometimes it is just a matter of perspective, right? What some people would see as a failure, just do a little different twist on it, and it's actually a success, or could be seen as a success. That's an important example, because see, that's what the Bible does with almost every area of our life. The world tells us your marriage needs to be like this, your sexuality needs to be like this, your job needs to be like this, your friendships need to be like this. The scriptures hardly ever affirm what our world and culture tell us, hardly ever. They always take a different slant on it, as many of you know. That's why we study the Bible, and it's actually a much better slant than anything our world would tell us. But that's important for success and failure, because if you buy into what the world tells you, then you're going to think at many times you're doing the wrong thing in your life as a failure. But the Bible comes along and says, let's change our paradigm on what failure and success are. And so let me share with you a couple of scriptures. Some of you men are saying, finally. Let me share with you a couple of scriptures that might help us understand what you and I need to value in life. How many of you have heard of the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament? Many of you, I think so. Some of you didn't raise your hand, but you've heard of it, right? The book of Ecclesiastes. I tell you, it's one of Darrell Delhouset's favorite books, and it's one of mine as well, because it's a very existential book. It's a very philosophical book. It's probably written by Solomon, we think, who's asking and answering the question, what is life really about? Just from sort of a 40,000-foot level, as I look at the terrain of life and all the different options that I have, what is life about? And I love it. It's kind of like reading a novel. If you go just to the last 5 pages and read the end of the novel, if you just go to the last chapter of Ecclesiastes, you'll get the answer, of at least what the book says the purpose of life is. And so in chapter 12, verse 13, at the close of the book, here's what he says. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13. Just listen to this. He says, now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the entire duty of man. Wow. Don't you love reductionist thinking? I do. It's like he's talking about all this intricate stuff. If you read, you got to read Ecclesiastes if you've never read it, but he's talking about all these intricate things of riches and fame and success and friendships and worldly pleasure and hedonism and all these different topics through chapter after chapter. It's actually kind of depressing. You know, and even that famous chapter that the Byrds wrote the song about, you know, for everything there was a season, you know, a time to this, a time to that, time to that. That's not a positive thing. I mean, you know, the Byrds made it a positive song, but you know, the writer of Ecclesiastes was saying, isn't it a bummer? Like everything just on and on and on. There's a time for this and a time for that, and you never win and all this. And it's kind of a negative book. And then he gets to the end, and he says, but here's the deal. Fear God, obey him in this life, because that's the entire duty of man. Jeremiah, one of the greatest prophets in the Old Testament, would say it this way in Jeremiah 9, verses 23 and 24. I love this passage. This is so, speaks to Scottsdale, probably more than any other passage I read in the Bible. Jeremiah 9, 23 and 24. He says, this is what the Lord says, let not the wise man boast of his wisdom, or the strong man boast of his strength, or the rich man boast of his riches, but let him who boasts boast about this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who exercises kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth, for in these I delight, declares the Lord. Gosh, isn't that so cool? It's like God is prying our hands off of our world's definition of success there. Wisdom, riches, wealth. He's prying our fingers off that and just trying to get us to grab onto kindness, justice, faith, a theistic, and then get to the New Testament, Christocentric focus to our lives on Jesus and all that he is to us. And it's interesting, the Bible never says here that you can't have wealth, strength, wisdom, and a vital relationship with God. It's certainly not saying that. It's simply saying that one must take priority over the other. I've said this to you guys 1,000 times. I think C.S. Lewis nailed it when he said it's all about first things and second things. And life is filled with a lot of wonderful second-place things, like your money and your hobbies, your joys, even your family. He says those are all good second-place things. There's only one first-place thing, and that's God and Jesus Christ. But we are so good at taking good second-place things, putting them in first place, taking the great first-place thing and placing it in second place. Jeremiah is saying the same thing here. Jesus said the same thing when he gave us the two greatest commandments. You guys remember what those are? Love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the two greatest things we can pour our lives into. And I think one of the side benefits of continually seeing life this way, and we're still just on our first point, of continually seeing life this way, is that it really nudges and hammers home that how you see and define failure versus success really needs to be from a biblical Christian standpoint. Are you guys starting to see this? It really matters. You know, people hear the two great commandments and think, yeah, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor. Next. I was like, man, can you imagine if the average Christian just parked him or herself in front of that for an entire day and said, all day today, every thought I think, every emotion I feel, every act that I do is going to be completely 100% guided by those two commandments. I'm not going to talk to my wife. I'm not going to respond to my child. I'm not going to do anything at work. I'm going to treat every service provider in light of love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. We had an event, I can't tell you all the details, we had an event happen last week with our church that was doing something in the community, and we bumped into another church. Let me just say it that way. Not literally, but we bumped into them in the sense of just kind of like getting in the way of each other. And it became a push against shove thing, which you always love among Christians, don't you? And it became kind of thing, and I actually called Schrader and had some pray for us and all this, and I had to meet with this other pastor and all that, and then I had to meet with my team over this, and we were having lunch on Friday when I was supposed to be doing my sermon. I'm sitting there meeting at Jason's Deli with my team trying to say, what are we going to do about this bump that we've experienced? And I don't know if you guys have ever had like utter moments of clarity, but I do every once in a while. My wife would tell you they're sparse, but every once in a while. And as I was sitting there over lunch, the second great commandment just hit me like a ton of bricks. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. it just became clear to me that the answer of what we do with this particular church that we're dealing with is that we take the high road, we do the right thing, because if we were in their shoes, that's exactly what we'd want from them. And I shared that with the guys. And it was one of those moments where, I could tell all the guys were saying, well, yeah, that's exactly the right thing to do, and we don't want to do it. And isn't that just the way life is? That's the right thing to do, but we're struggling with doing it. But then there's that old saying, too, that you fake it till you make it, which is a nice way of saying you obey God even when you don't feel like it. And we did. And we all slept well that night. We all worshiped great on Sunday. And then we had another meeting on Monday, and the kingdom of God advances, and people are pleased, and God is happy. And it reminded me once again just the power of defining success and failure from Jesus' standpoint, from the Bible's standpoint, not from our own. You want to deal with failure? Begin by defining it for what it really is, and by clarifying for you what's really important. Now, a bit more quickly, because we have just a few minutes till we go to questions, I want to share with you 3 other biblical truths. And these are just kind of a hodgepodge, by the way. These are just thoughts that have hit me over the year on failure, so I think that they don't necessarily build one upon the other, but I think you'll find them helpful. Here's the second one, and that is allow true failures to deepen you. That's the second thing we need about failure. And the key there is true failures. Allow true failures to deepen you. And by true failures, what I mean is that even when we clearly define for ourselves what failure and success are, we're still going to fail at times, right? So I'm not trying to weasel us out of failure today. That's why I'm thinking of it this week. Some of you are thinking, why is he thinking about failure this week? Well, because even when I define failure rightly, I still experience it. Even when I define it spiritually and relationally, I still fall and I still struggle. And so there are going to be times when you and I have godly goals and good priorities, and we're going to fall short of them, and we're going to misplace our priorities. And yet one of the things that so many good people who have failed over the years have found is that if you allow failures to deepen you, to make you more compassionate, more empathetic, sensitive, and most importantly, trusting in God, then you might even look back on your failures and say, wow, I never thought something so painful could produce such a great benefit. And so in this way, I guess what I want you guys to picture in your mind's eye right now is that failure, I think, is a signpost at a fork in the road. I have found that failure always does one of 2 things to a man. It either hardens you and makes you more difficult to want to be around, or it softens you, makes you more wise, makes you a better man of character, and somebody that your wife and your kids and your friends and all those around you want to be around. I find failure ever leaves a person the same, especially when it's a significant failure, say a failed marriage, or failure in our parenting, or failure in our morality, or even failure at work and with our finances, which can be an integrity issue. I find failure either leaves us so discouraged and defeated that we then obsessively fear it for the rest of our lives, which I think a lot of men live with, or it can cause us to go deeper into uncharted personal and spiritual territory in which we meet God. And in finding God in the midst of our failure, for some reason, we're not as terrified about it the next time, because we know that we might meet God there again. The Bible actually told us this 2,000 years ago. I want you to listen to another profound passage in Romans chapter 5, verses 3 and 4. It's a passage, if I don't miss my guess, those of you who've been around the Christian block have heard a few times because it's quoted quite often. But it's a passage that I think, when you see in light of failure, can take on new meaning. Here's what it says. It says, not only so, but we also rejoice in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, character hope, and hope does not disappoint us. So if you can see failure as a form of suffering, is failure a form of suffering? It is. When you fail, you're suffering in your spirit, many times even outwardly. So when you have suffering due to failure, the Bible says that if you can learn to persevere through that, and we'll get to what that means more in a minute, but dig deep, dig your heels in, Love God, focus on Him, trust Him, determined to grow through this. If you can have that kind of persevering mindset through your failure, then the Bible says there's a really good chance that character will be deepened in you. You will be more humble, righteous, loving. You'll be more of a human being that God wants you to be. And the result of that will be hope. Like purpose, meaning, Christ-centered, God is in the center of my life, hope. So that's what failure can do. Suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, character, hope, and hope does not disappoint. And so here's the deal. If some of you men right now are dealing with failure in your life, like right here this morning, you're like going, oh my gosh, this is so relevant, I can't even tell you, Jamie. I have failure right now in my life. Please see a signpost right in your life right now. You literally are at a fork in the road. You can go down the road of increased discouragement and disappointment and hardening when it comes to the things that you have failed in, or you can go down the road of humility and growth leading to deeper character when it comes to God. You know, this is such a real issue for most men, and I laugh at this kind of now, but the year was 1987, and I was halfway through seminary, and I got to tell you guys, I had an almost neurotic, probably was a neurotic fear of failure. I grew up in a high-performance home. My dad was a Harvard-educated lawyer, wildly successful, upper middle class, never wanted for anything. I had now become a Christian. I'm going off to graduate school, and the pressure I felt to succeed was greater than anything I've ever had in my life. And actually, psychologists would have probably, and I was talking to my son about this last night, psychologists probably would have labeled me with an anxiety disorder. I hate that because that sounds so ominous, but they would have, because I had a level of anxiety in my life, free-floating anxiety that was almost crippling. And I was so afraid to move forward. I was so afraid of failing. I just didn't want to try anything because, you know, that old adage that the higher you go, the harder you fall. I figured if I didn't go that high, I couldn't fall that far. And so I was almost crippled with fear. And I was interning that summer at a church that I would eventually become the senior pastor of. Isn't that interesting? It was my home church, my sending church in Chagrin Falls, Ohio, called Fellowship Bible Church. 15 years later, I'd become the senior pastor. I had no idea of this. But in 1987, I was a lowly intern in this church, and only one intern. They couldn't afford much. It was just a church of 200 people. And my mentor, who's now with the Lord, was Doug Flood. And Doug was a wise, older guy who'd just been around the block a lot, understood failure and all of that. And one day I just unloaded on him in my office. I cried. I literally sat in his office and cried. I'm so terrified of failing. And Doug was a lot like Corey, which is interesting in the sense that he was a man of very few words. He was not verbose at all. He was an introvert off the scale. And he was very wise, and many times he'd just give you what I call the Doug stare. He'd just stare at you as you were talking. Eventually, when I became his boss, I said, you got to stop staring at me. It makes me insecure. But he'd just stare at you when you're talking. But his wheels were churning. And that day he was staring at me, and when I got done unloading with him, he just said one very simple sentence. He said, well, many times I find that people have to fail if they're ever going to stop fearing it. So get on with life, get on with your ministry, fail, and you probably won't fear it as much. I remember thinking that's the dumbest thing I'd ever heard in my life up to that point. I remember thinking, you're basically telling me I have to fail in order to stop fearing it. I don't want to fail. I actually didn't receive his advice at that time. I thought that's terrible advice. That's like I just thought of all these dumb analogies. He was right. I didn't go out and look for failure, but I never really got over my fear of failure, its bite and its bark, until I started to experience it a little bit, until I did children's ministry in 1991, until I tried my hand at being an executive pastor and realized I was a better leader than a manager, until I tried my first pastorate in a church in Canada and realized, eek, that's not the right church for me. I kind of didn't choose as wisely as I could have. There are lots of things I've tried over the years. When I tried Youth for Christ, and I realized that though I couldn't do well at children, I did equally as bad at teens. And so I realized that there are lots of things I've tried my hand at that I'm not very good. And after a few failures in your life, what you end up finding is it's not quite as bad as you think, and even better, God is in it. And I'd like to think that Doug was right, that he's used just about every failure I've had for his glory and his purpose. Isn't that amazing? I met with some pastors recently who attained great heights in their ministries and careers. By all standards, they were a success, only to fall and lose it all. There's a few of those stories right here, right now in Phoenix or in Arizona. And yet one of the things I'm impressed with many of these pastors that I've met with that have experienced that is that they're looking right at God. They're saying, I lost my church, but God is still on the throne. And I think he's doing something in my life. And I think he's still up to something in my life. They didn't give in to defeat. And this kind of brings us to the third thing that you need to do from your failures is to learn from your failures then, right? To learn from them. George Santayana was a great philosopher, and he's the one who coined the phrase that some of you have heard. It's the phrase, those who ignore the past are doomed to repeat it. And it's really true. Many people live kind of like an ostrich with their head in their sand when it comes to the past. And if you do that, you're probably going to repeat it. And part of failure is slowing down enough to realize that if you can learn from it, there's a good chance you won't do the same thing again. That's why a second marriage, even though a second marriage doesn't stand a very good chance of making it, I mean, the chance of a first marriage making is about 50%, it's about 75%, or I'm sorry, it's only 25% of second marriages make it. But for those who learn, and those who grow, and those who understand what marriage biblically is really about, they're the ones that tend to make second marriages work. And the cool thing, again, Failure Magazine, you guys got to go to this, it's really kind of cool, lists actually people who were seen as greatly successful in their lives, even experienced great failures, but then learned from their failures. We're able to do better. It's the old thing with Thomas Edison. You guys heard that, right? Thomas Edison tried about 10,000 different ways, to make a light bulb, and on the 10,000th time, he made a light bulb, and we all remember memory light bulb, but he would say about his life that he had 9,999 failures at making a light bulb. And so I found these kind of fun here. You'll like this, Javier. America's best pro basketball teams lose the basketball every 3 minutes without even getting up a shot. The best basketball teams. Brett Favre has scored more NFL touchdowns than anybody else in the history. I think he still holds that. Of any other NFL quarterback. He's also thrown the most interceptions. So with all of his success has come failure. Fred Smith. You guys know who Fred Smith is? He's the founder of what? Federal Express. Fred Smith got a C on the graduate business school paper in which he described the concept for Federal Express. I thought that was great. I would submit to you that teacher was a failure who gave him a C on that concept. 3M, the great company, almost went out of business until in 1904 they invented sandpaper. And then they became a success. There's lots of little quips like this in which people learn from their failures. As we're going to see in a second here, they hung in there. And even from a worldly perspective, which you and I are not as much into, but from a worldly perspective, they were able to turn failure into success. And what you need to know is that this was exactly one of the great lessons that Jesus tried to teach his disciples. Again, let's go back to the Bible real quickly. All of you guys know who Peter is, right? Peter the apostle. And was Peter arguably a failure after he denied Jesus Christ 3 times? I think he would have been. I'm not trying to indict the poor guy, but I think that if you follow the Son of God around for 3 years on this earth, and he clearly told you he was going to go to the cross and then rise on the 3rd day, and he clearly told you that he was the Son of God, come to take away the sin of the world, and he clearly told you to remain faithful, to stay awake, and all of that, and then for you to deny him in front of people 3 different times, even when he predicted you'd do so, I think by anybody's imagination, you could call yourself, at least in that moment, a spiritual and relational failure. And Peter felt that. And so, as many of you know, Jesus wanted to help him with that failure. And so let me read for you the account in John 21. Just listen to this. It's John 21, verses 14 to 17. Of when Jesus tried to did reinstitute Peter. It says this was now the third time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" Simon answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt. I thought that's classic, by the way. Peter was hurt. Way to turn it around on him. Because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things, and you know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." So, many people are confused by this passage. They're actually hard-pressed to try to discern or put their finger on what exactly Jesus is doing here. I think it's powerful. I think it's an obvious act of reinstatement in which Jesus is hammering home to Peter to learn from his failure, learn the valueness of faithfulness to others, of not abandoning them, but how to love others and stay true to them in and through everything. I think that's what that passage is saying. Isn't it interesting? The one failure Peter had is that he didn't stay faithful to loving Jesus. He didn't stay faithful to saying, "Jesus Christ is my Lord." And I think Jesus' fear is that Peter was now going to become a pillar and rock of the very first church, that if he couldn't remain faithful to those he served with and remain faithful to his sheep, then he was in trouble. And so what Jesus is hammering home here is, if you love me, feed my sheep, guide them, love them like you love me. And in reinstating Peter, he's also helping him to learn from his failures. And you got to believe that Peter did, right? Like some of you who have crashed and burned spiritually or relationally, you look back on that time, and though you don't enjoy it, you say, "Thank God that he brought me through it, and I pray every day that I've learned from that, and God will never help me go back to that trash ever again." I think that way a lot in my life, guys. I didn't come to Christ till I was about 17 or 18, and I know what my life was like before I knew Christ, and I don't ever want to go back to that trash again. And some of you, and I'm not indicting you here at all, as Christians have experienced that, because certainly that's possible. You've crashed and burned big time as Christians, and God in his wonderful grace, as Psalm 40 says, has reached down, pulled you out of the muck and mire, and placed you on dry ground. And now he's saying, learn from that time. Don't ever go back to that. Keep your 2-year coin, your 3-year coin, your 4-year coin, whatever your coin is of sobriety or whatever it is, and keep it in your pocket. And then the last thing is, apply perseverance to failure, and many times you will find success. And we hinted at this earlier. I think the way that we keep our sights set on success as Christian men is to persevere during difficult times. I think it's one of the hardest things for men today, especially coming out of our recession. Apply perseverance to failure, and many times you'll find success. There's an old saying that you guys all know that goes like this: if at first you don't succeed, try again. W.C. Fields, who thought he was being funny, actually recoined that phrase. He said, "If at first you don't succeed, try again, then quit. There's no point in making a fool of yourself." I'm glad some of you laughed, but I also thought to myself, what an idiot. Because I don't think that's right. I think the quip, if at first you don't succeed, try again, is awfully biblical. Churches are a lot like individuals. They struggle and fail at times. Even the very first Christian churches in the New Testament struggled with a lot of failure. Ephesus couldn't get unified. Corinth couldn't even get simple morality right. Thessalonica was struggling with error and false teachers. So was Philippi. And listen to what Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 1:4 to this one church. He says, "Therefore, among God's churches, we boast about your perseverance and your faith in all the persecutions and trials that you're enduring." It is really rare that you will find a New Testament writer saying, "I boast about you." It's rare. I think it's Zephaniah or Zechariah where it actually says that God sings praises over his people. It's like a reverse of what you usually read, that we sing praises to God. God sings praises over his people. And it's very rare in the New Testament that you'll find one of the writers saying, "We boast about you." Because their admission was to boast in nothing but the Lord. But here, Paul actually breaks his rule, and says, I am so proud of your perseverance. I'm so proud of your faith in the midst of all of your persecutions and trials that I'm actually boasting among God's churches about you guys in Thessalonica. I cannot tell you, man, how many times I've seen this work. People who have gutted out a difficult marriage, gutted out a dead-end job, gutted out a relationship in which it was sandpaper and friction to no end, gutted out financial woes. It's in different dollars today, but I can remember my first church, we were really into Larry Burkett's stuff on financial freedom, and then we adopted a lot of Crown Ministry stuff on financial freedom, and we helped a lot of our young burgeoning church through some difficult financial times. When was the recession? 89 was a recession, Jack, the last one before, and that hit a lot of our guys in Detroit. And I remember one guy who was a single guy, and he wasn't making much money. I think he was making like $36,000 a year, and he had $30,000 alone in credit card debt. And this was before the day where you would just declare personal bankruptcy and get out. That wasn't very common back then. And his name was Tyrone. I remember Tyrone took a course on either Burkett or Larry Crown, Burkett or Crown, and he would commit to paying $800 a month for however long it took to get out of debt. And I remember seeing him in the hallways and just saying, how's that debt thing going? He'd say, I'm paying it every month. $800, making $36,000 a year. That's a tremendous amount of money. And I remember the day he paid it all off. I remember the day that he got out of it. He persevered through that. And I just so respect him, and I saw such amazing character in him as a result. I could tell you so many stories of people who persevered in the midst of life's failures only to experience success. So let's define failure and success differently for us. We don't buy into the world's systems. We buy into what God says we value and prioritize. Let's also persevere in the midst of failure. And when we really do fail, let's learn from them and not be afraid of them. I am not a poster child for how to avoid failure and be successful in my life right now. Not at all. I still deal with this fear of failure quite often. But I think the truths that we have talked about here today are extremely life-giving. They have been for me, how we can all approach life a little bit differently when it comes to the things that we struggle with and even the fears that we have. We might head back to Hebrews 10 next week, or I might talk about the fear of death or the fear of God or something like that. I'm just going to, if you guys don't mind, I'm going to see how I feel, which I never really function out of that level. So it's just kind of fun to do that. And so hopefully you'll show up and we'll talk about whatever we talk about.